Thank you, Frantz. Good afternoon. Once again, thank you for being here. Of the three of the four talks, my talk, as in last time, has two sections. You'll see that one, as Frantz Grenet mentioned, is about mapping and sort of how to vision this Iran Shahr. I have added a second part, which is really important, and that is what that does in terms of where this place is and who are the people in it. And I think there's a cultural turn that takes place here. And I should, since Anka Dan is here, I should thank her. This was an idea that we had talked about many times, and she has helped me, especially for mapping. So I really am thankful and happy to have her. But I would like to dedicate the talk, as I do every one of them, to a friend who's gone now, very early, Mohsen Zakeri. Mohsen was really an interesting person, an Arabist, who was able to retrieve, or had begun to retrieve, what we did not know about the Sasanian world. This is an 800-page, two-volume work on Persian wisdom in Arabic garb. Really an amazing tome that I think has not been noticed. And there's so much in there that actually many dissertations and works can be done on it. Of course, his famous work is on the Sassanid soldiers in the early Islamic society, which was received with much criticism. We had planned to do an article together on geography, which was mainly his work. But I'm going to show you some of the things that we were discussing, that it never happened. And so I have the documents, but I'm not sure what to do. Today, I would like to talk about empires and maps in relation to the Sasanian Empire. And do empires need maps? That is a question, of course, it's a historiographical issue. And it pertains to historical cartography and geographical science. On the face of it, it should be clear that empires and those kingdoms that have such aspirations to become an empire are interested in control, in understanding, mapping, understanding physical versus maybe a mental one, and that's a debate. But you need to know the roads and borders. A good example is a recent publication, and my PhD student Mark Grodoni has been dealing with, is the Imperial Eyes by Louis Pran on empires where they go to make roads. They want to understand the makeup of an empire. And so this is not a holistic map, but a road map to understand distances from city to city. And this is really, I think, more important in some ways for an empire than what we think in the early modern of making maps with boundaries and so on, which is really, I think, a preoccupation of much later times. But to understand terrains and cities is what really, I think, is important. And of course, there have been many conferences, including mapping empires, but this is, again, much more dealing with colonial cartographies of sea and land. But I think all the same, this pertains to the late ancient world in a different way, rather than boundary per se, but more of understanding roads and so on. So again, in my dealings with Anka, we've talked about this, and she's been directing me. The famous example is the Roman tabula Peutingeriana, which its existence as a Roman map has been a matter of debate, where we have a 13th century recension, where there's a suggestion that, in fact, in the 5th century, the Romans did have a map, and this was really a road map. And it tried to understand distances. And you can see that card 10 and 11, especially 11 deals with the Iranian world, with many terminologies that need actually to be deciphered. And that, I think, is a task of whoever is dealing with geography. It's really interesting, especially card 11. So the Romans appear to have had some sort of a road map. And this is the recension of it. Debate over the Sasanian world and whether that empire had a map is interesting. I have not mentioned Dan Shapiro in this page, but he's the one that has pushed the table on showing that, or trying to demonstrate that the Sasanians never had a map, never had this idea as such. However, if we look at, of course, Carlo Ceretti, who is a scholar of Zoroastrianism and Middle Persian, he has tried to show, based on the Middle Persian evidence, that there should have been, there may have been. But even more importantly, I think Kramer's work on the influence of this Iranian world and its ideas on the early Islamic, which is really in some ways a continuation of our late Sasanian world, shows evidence to the contrary of what is presented, that the Sasanians had no map. And so I would like to just furnish for you this debate. Of course, among Middle Persian texts, we do hear of interest in Western, by Western I mean Greek and Roman study of geography and the stars. It's clear, as I think Professor Azandra is going to publish this as Dinkat 4, I'm not sure if I remember, but Magist, which the Middle Persians texts call it Magistage Horumai, or Humai, Roman Magist, and the name of Ptolemy Batlamyus and Magistag does appear in Middle Persian writing. So there is a knowledge, and the idea as well, was this because of a early Islamic retention, or was it an addition? Which one is this? Is this idea of knowing Ptolemies, for example, Almagest? And so that is something I think since Nalino in the 1920s had already discussed, and then it was Bailey who in the 1940s really brought these terms and readings of these Middle Persian terms, which seem to have Greek or Roman actually influence. So we have that in terms of just names. In Middle Persian, there are 3 or 4 mentions to either texts or texts that may suggest a knowledge of geography. The first one is the Ayadegar Shahriha, Memoirs of Cities, which appear in the Bundahesh. So there is this memoir of cities, but we're not clear. It says, as it is stated in the Memoirs of Cities. The book that I have sort of just put my name on it, and I apologize, is this short Middle Persian text on important cities within this place that calls Iran Shah, the empire of the Iranians. It gives its place in a quadrant in the 4 quarters, one of the quarters, which seems to be a Sasanian administrative division. And then it talks about how it was started, who built it, how it continued, and so on. So again, it's a mention of cities. And in my first lecture, when I was talking about the importance of Sistan as an avenue of the idea of Iran, Professor was trying to, in the first one, trying to discuss how this idea enters Fars, where this Avestan world and its ideas in Sistan is really there in the 1st and 2nd centuries, which moves west. And I mentioned this text because it's really interesting, very short, 1 page in the manuscript, I think, or 2, but it has a lot. And it's really Sistan-centric. And that also tells us, among all the surviving texts, why is Sistan the one that is so important in this Zoroastrian tradition. Now, the book that I want to mention today is a book that in Arabic sources is called Al-Qawadian. And Al-Qawadian is what I need to discuss in the next couple of slides. Now, the issue has been, of course, if there was a map, is it a product of the Sasanians, or is there an influence from the West, namely Rome? And we're talking about 5th to 6th century, and this is for the period of cultural turn that I'm thinking. Was there a Roman or Byzantine influence on Middle Persian literature? I think Anka has written on this as I've sort of cited this. There seems to be evidence. But I think there's more. And this is where I and mainly, I should say, Mohsen Zakeri came together. As I was interested in Middle Persian, he was interested in Arabic. So was there a map of the Sasanian Empire? And Kramer, already in studying an Arabic manuscript of Ibn Huqal for the geographical text Surat al-Arz, had seen a variant in a manuscript in the Istanbul, I think it was in the Istanbul Topkapi manuscript, where the correct reading he thought was something like Kawadian or Kawad. And it was an Iranian shader who had told him that this is probably referring to King Kawad, as you're saying, late 5th, early 6th century emperor, king of kings of the Sasanians. So it may be referring to him in that book. And so in this text, Tabaqat al-Muhaddithin, an Arabic text, that we find that a Christian family, who are Persian, apparently, are discussed in this way. Al-Nushjan related to me from his uncle, Ya'qub ibn Ali Nasrani, that Firuz, that is King Piruz, son of Yazdgerd. So this is actually, again, we'll come to it, Piruz, son of Yazdgerd, invited an expert from Rome to survey Iran and choose the best places to found a new city. So it seems, again, someone from Rome has been invited to come to Persia. And in this text, another one, Ahl al-Bayutat al-Nushjan, which is continuing of this tradition, it's really interesting. The text reads, the Persian kings never preferred any city in their country over Isfahan. So some people would be very interested in that, Sinajan. This was due to the pleasantness of its air, the slubbriousness of its water, and the breeze of its soil, and the evidence for that that what is present in their narratives deposited within the covers of the books, especially what the family of Al-Nushijan, these are our Christian Persian family here, and Ishaq, the son of Abdul Masih, that should give it away that it's Christian, have reported of their ancestors who immigrated from Rome or Byzantium, to Isfahan, where he settled and procreated. So again, we're getting this evidence of a family from Rome is invited and they come and they seem to know something about map making. Again, the Roman responded, I found, O king, the most of these descriptions, few of them missing in Iran Shah, which is Isfahan. Again, Isfahan becomes its center, and we found the most fertile places of the kingdom in 10 areas. So places are mentioned. So there is knowledge of cities, some sort of a mental map, and we're getting Romans being taken there. And again, the text continues. When the Romans received the commission of the king. So there seems to have been some form of commissioning, at least in the Arabic sources. He cruised in the cities of the kingdom till his choice fell upon Isfahan. Again, Isfahan seems to be this important place. And he stayed there and wrote to the king Piruz, our 5th century ruler, I've traversed your kingdom, and I finished in a country that no corruption taints any of its pillars, and I have settled there between the two forts, and so on. Now, did this text survive? And that is a question to have. And let me just give you one more about King Kawad. And in the 6th century, when Kawad or Kawad, a differentiated kingdom, became familiar with its parts, surveyed the lands, and counted the leagues, he moved the nobles from Fars, Khorasan, Isfahan, Rai, Hamadan, Mah, Nihavand, and Mah Dinar, and the text continues. So he seems to have the king surveyed the land, he knows the leagues and the distances. So we're moving really not only a mental map, I think a little bit more. And what happens is, when the last Sasanian king, Yazgerd III, is defeated, and when his sons, one of them goes to the east to bring help, and our text, Ibn Faqih in Al-Buldan, which Mohsen Zakari has discussed, states that Ibn Qutayba, the conqueror there, he captured his Piruz's daughter, and her name seems to have been Shah Farid. And the text is a bit longer, so I've truncated, so you just know the gist or the important matters of it. He sent her to Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who handed her to Abd al-Malik, the governor, an important ruler. And Al-Hajjaj, meanwhile, sees a basket, as this text mentions, opened the sealed basket and discovered a book in it written in Persian. Zadan Farrokh translated it, so he has someone who's bilingual. And it reads, Qubad, son of Firuz, let his country be surveyed. So there seems to have been a text, and it, as Mohsen mentioned, this probably is the Al-Qabadian. It's the book of Qubad, which was a map of the Sasanian Empire, which the Muslims now possessed. If this is so, and we can trust some of these texts, then what do we do with the development of early Islamic cartography? That is better studies and much more, especially in the 20th century. Tibbets is one of these important people who suggests that the earliest maps that we have, like this one, of the world, between Estakhri and Al-Balkhi, probably originate from an earlier recension. His suggestion is actually based on a postal road map that may have existed in the Sasanian Empire, and Ibn Khordad Beh used it. So these, there are two recensions of map making in the Islamic world. So this is one recension, which seems to be on earlier, and it's very Persian-centric, Iran-centric. Iran and Fars ends up in the middle of some of these maps, and so they can tell that there is some sort of a bias towards this Sasanian Iran Shah, towards this world. If we have a cursory look at Middle Persian texts, we find that from time to time, we find that distances are mentioned. Distances between this place and them is 21 frasang. The term itself for measurements, frasang, is important in many ways. It's a distance which covers on foot in an hour, like a marching mile, not always the same. It differs and it depends on the sort of topography, but you have the sense of it. Farsang coming from prasang and so on. The measurements at least are mentioned in some ways, but of course not directly. Now, that is the precursor to our idea of a map. So let's just move forward with thinking there may have been a Sasanian map. How did these Iranians and the Sasanian in the late antique world come up with a map? What was their view? And this is, of course, better known. This is a nice earring that Shapur Shahbazi once published in relation to his daughter called Persepolis and the Vesta, where he looks at these 7 figures and connects it to the 7 climes. That is, in the Zoroastrian world, as he suggests, 7 is an important number, and the world is seen as 7 climes, actually, klime, but also as 7 sort of parts. Now, I know as early as de Mizel has suggested that this is a work on the part of the Zoroastrians, because in the Indo-European tradition, the Indic and even mentions the Irish one, it seems to be a 5th. So there's a jump, a movement from a 5th to a 7th in the Zoroastrian world. So the world has 7 climes or 7 places, and if you want to know, and I'm sorry about that mishap, in the Avesta and the Mehr Yasht, continuing with our Mithra conferences, these 7 places are shown on this nicely made map by from Mary Boyce's book, where the 7 climes of the earth, as you can see here mentioned, And the text says, of course, Arzehi Savehi Fradadafshu Vidadafshu Vurubereshti Vurujereshti, and the splendid one, and that's the most important one, which is Chawanira, and I made a spelling there mistake, the land of settled dwellings and healthy village colonization. All of these areas, but all in all, in this Zoroastrian sort of a Western world, it's the central clime. It's Chawanira that is habitable. Actually, the text in the West, I think, suggests that the other 6 lands are where the Daiwas and others exist. And it's really the central clime, which you can see the Harabar Zaiti, and as we talked, Gave Ivdad in the first one, and Gayo Martham, or the first man and the first cow, are in Chawanirata. And that's where all the events are going to take place. Now, when the Zoroastrians in late antiquity, in the Sasanian period, began to write commentaries on this Avestan 7 climes, of course, an interesting development takes place. Here it says that in the Bundaheshen, in the Middle Persian Zoroastrian text, that the day when Tishtar brought rain, from which the seas came about, all places gathered moisture and water, it was made into 7 parts. But interestingly, now these 7 parts become all habitable. So from a Western central clime habitable, 6 uninhabitable. In the Middle Persian tradition, there's a movement where all 7 become habitable. So it's just not Chawanira. And here's a Middle Persian text of Bundaheshen, translated by Carlo Cerretti. And so again, we have all of the places that I just mentioned to you, Vidadraf and Fradadaf and so on. And lastly, it seems that 2 parts in between is Chawanira. Chawanira is larger than all of them. Chawanira seems to be double in size. Again, we're talking about the central clime. And what the Sasanians appear to have done is to transpose their empire, Iran Shah, over Chawanira. That is, that central clime becomes the entire empire of the Sasanians. And so it's said that Iran Shah is the best place, and essentially it's the central place. And then these other people who the Sasanians have to deal with or have been moved and pushed out to these other climes. And again, all the goodness is created most in Chawanira, which now Iran Shah becomes its central sort of land, and these other people are all around it. Again, and it's in Chawanira that the Achaemenids that we talked about in the first lecture are there. The savior Sasanians are going to come into being. So all the important events is in that central clime of Iran Shah. So I hope this is clear, that this central clime is now associated with the Sasanian Empire. This Sasanian Empire also administratively divided its empire into 4 quarters, as we know. And this is based on sigillographic evidence, which we'll talk about. 4 kousts, or corners, or quarters, cantons, however you want to translate it, are created. These are the northwestern, southwestern, southeastern, and northwestern. Khorasan, Khwarbaran, Nimruz, and Adar Badagan. And this is something, this map is from Farrokh, Karamian, and Maxim Yumik, who have sort of tried to create this division as they see it in terms of the 4 quarters. That is what they think that these quarters look like in the Sasanian division. Not only administratively, but militarily, this empire is divided into 4 quarters. Now, in the past 2 decades, since Rika Gislin's work on the Espahbet seals, these are the generals of the empire who seem to, again, be assigned to 4 quarters. We know of their genealogy because we have the bulla. So even in a Middle Persian text called Surah Sokhan, where there's this dinner speech given out, praises are given out to each of these generals, each to one of these quarters. So we know that, in fact, there is a quadripartition of this empire militarily, administratively, and so on. So, Iran-Shah is the middle one. And now, how do you protect this? How do you differentiate? How do you have boundaries between this Iran-Shah, which is in the middle, where the Iranians live, and of course the issue of what is an Iranian? That is, of course, a matter of discussion. From the 3rd century, from Shapur's Kabe Zartosht inscription, we find that this empire of Shapur has both Iranians and non-Iranians. And so Ir, at least in the 3rd century, seems to be associated with ethnos. And if you look at this list, it is a long list, and it is why Shapur is both the king of Iran and Iran, that is Iranians and non-Iran. It's really difficult to say where is Iran per se, just looking at this map, which of course I've used Philip Hoyse's translation or work on this to a certain in the 3rd century. We have to thank Kerdir, this wonderful priest of the 3rd century, who also has left his inscriptions, who says who has walked or has actually on horse gone with the kings of the 3rd centuries. And for him, he mentions all the places that he goes and the things that he does. He says in this part, and many fires and Magians, Zoroastrian priests in the empire of Iran-Shah, and then he goes to name them. Pars, Pahlav, Khuzestan, Susa, Mishan, Asuristan, and so on, I have made prosperous. So in a sense, at least he has some sort of a Iran-Shah, and seems to be then it's either ethnos or religious, that he has an idea. And Kerdir then talks about an Iran-Shah, the non-Iranian places, which the king, that is Shapur, went to, that is in Antioch, Tarsus, Cappadocia, Pontus, probably Armenia, Iberia, that is Georgia, and Balasagan, Republic of Azerbaijan, up to the Alan Gates. So for Kerdir, this is not Iran. These are not where the Iranians are. It's an Iran-Shah. So in the 3rd century, there is an idea, and I think it's more on ethnos and religious base than anything else. Okay? That is our 3rd century Iran or an Iran. Again, the land of Iran, again, giving us a sort of basic idea of what we have today in Iran and what is called East Iran. And that is because of Kerdir. And in later Persian texts, one of the earliest Persian texts, which is the preface to the Shahnameh, to the Book of Kings of Abu Mansur, before the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi is composed, there's the interesting passage that I usually invoke, that Iran-Shah, the Persian text is from Amu Darya, and there's now a variant reading, and scholars actually fight over the manuscript. Is it Misr, Nile, or Forat, Euphrates River? And these other regions are around it. And from these 7 regions, Iran-Shah is the most magnanimous in every part. I think there's a play here where Misr or Egypt shows this imperial sort of imperialistic sort of activity, as some of these manuscripts may have indicated. But of course, all in all, we know that Euphrates was the traditional boundary. And the idea is that from river to river is counted as a boundary on the east and west. This brings to my mind at least the idea of earth and water, which I gave a lecture in Inalco 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I don't remember, on the idea of earth and water. And this association of earth and water, not to be an Orientalist in the West trying to be, but this idea of earth and water today, even some, I think non-Iranians are quite perplexed why these Iranians are so sort of stuck to water and its naming. I think it has an idea that earth and water both represents this nation. And of course, when we look at early Greek work, we understand that the Achaemenid Persians wanted submission from other places when they received symbolically the earth and water, and that becomes a huge issue when, for example, Athenians promise it and then they don't submit, and so on. And that causes really the beginning of wars that are going to take on in the 6th century BCE. Middle Persian texts are quite cognizant of the Romans, the Turks, the Chinese, the Arabs, the Indians, and of course, the Iranians. The Turks are a later phenomenon. I may be going to Istanbul, so I may talk about the Turks there a little bit more. And so these show probably of a late Middle Persian text, and I have inserted myself in there. And this is because I traveled to the Wall of Gorgan. And it's really important, I think, to have a feel of what you are talking about, if you can travel, and when I could. And so here with late Iraja Afshar, we took a trip to the Wall of Gorgan, which has been published now really in the great work of Eberhard Sauer, Rekavandi, and Nokande and others, as well as David Bivar's work on the Wall of Tamisha, and then Mortaz-Ali Gajiev, who is from Dagestan, who has access to the Wall of Derband, or as they call it, Derbent, and then the Wall of Arabs that more recently has been published, which is found in Iraq. So if we look at these walls, so this empire apparently at some time decides to make walls, not in its east and west, but it's certainly in its north place. And so this is the Persia's Imperial Power in Late Antiquity book that is quite important, that's been done in the past decade or more, which shows that from the Caspian Sea on the east, there was a 195-kilometer wall with 33 fortifications and gates. Gates are important in this matter. If you have gates, that means you don't want to keep people forever out. You just want to regulate the coming and going of who you're dealing with. So we know of this Wall of Gorgan. And the Wall of Derbent, which is west of the Caspian, is, of course, we see its medieval recension. Again, tall walls, expensive to upkeep. We have, I think, so far 33, and every couple of years, one more of these inscriptions are found by Gajiev. Whereas it seems that an amargar, an accountant, a tax collector, goes and had visited the wall in the Sasanian period, making sure that the wall is upkept. Now, why is this wall being upkept in this? Well, we can't see it on here, but of course, the common answer is to keep the nomadic incursions from the Caucasus in check. A very expensive endeavor. So we're talking about the Wall of Derbent here. So if this is the Wall of Gorgan, Qizil-Yilan, or however you want to call it, and here is where the Derbent wall to keep the nomadic incursions, as I would say, in check. It's both a defensive weapon and an offensive weapon. How? Well, the Sasanians exacted a lot of gold from the Romans in the name of keeping up the wall. And when the Romans refused, what did they do? They opened the gates and allowed nomadic forces go westward to create insecurity. And I don't want to be lambasted, as I sometimes make really not so interesting comparisons, but again, the Strait of Hormuz comes to me right again. But I want you to see how to use gates as leverages. And so already, I think in the 6th century, at least the gates, the Alan gates, or this Derbent wall is used that you pay. You don't pay, we're going to open it as opposed to close it today. Okay, so it is a political and an economic, actually, weapon if we want to think of walls. More recently, my colleague who I invited, who came from Turkmenistan, an amazing archaeologist, Aydogdi Kurbanov, who's been excavating in Turkmenistan, and so much is coming out that is absolutely amazing, was discussing a wall that was called Wall of Antiochus, and maybe Frantz Grenet can say more about this. But for him, he suggested that in fact this wall at last may have been erected between the 5th and the 6th century, which is visible. And he's given us some measurements, and this was part of his talk in the Eastern Frontiers of the Sasanian Empire, analysis of sites and finds in southern Turkmenistan. And so that was, of course, a revelation to me, and I think we wait for his publication. So this wall seems to go further into Central Asia. So walls are there to regulate, in that way of comings and goings. But of course it has symbolic and ideological and psychological dimensions as well. In one way, if you want to imagine it, and if you could look at the ears, the Iranians are behind the wall, right? And whatever is inside, Middle Persian texts and later sources suggest it's like a garden. There is law, order, beauty. And what is outside is nomadism, what in classics called barbarians, but I would like to mention something about in regards to that, where the really demons, and the verb uses davarist, they're roaming around outside. So there's an inside-outside, goodness, insecurity outside. And I think that has a long sort of meaning when these walls are created. So if this is the case, and today I have not mentioned the other wall, which I may have, there's the wall of Arabs that is in Iraq. It's called Khandaq Shapur. And now we have evidence that along the Persian Gulf, just to the south of it, there was a wall as well. So the Persian Gulf and the Sasanians actually encircled both sides, what is called the Arab side now, and the Iranian sides were under control. From the 3rd century, one of the earliest things that Ardashir, the founder, does is actually to conquer the Persian Gulf. I think there's a tacit understanding that you need to control the Persian Gulf. And the Sasanians do that. So, in this case, then, is everyone who is inside an Iranian? And everybody who's outside is an anir, a non-Iranians? Two works are, of course, quite important in this way. And I put the wrong one. It should have been an Iran, I think, work, which I think Philip Hoyce and Josef Wiesehofer actually edited. And then a more recent work was Persianism and Antiquity. What does it mean to this Persianism as a terminology? And this is something that I've had a discussion with our classicists. Classicists, of course, use the old Greek term for the other, those whose language is not understood, called barbarian and so on. But of course, in the modern day terminology, barbarian carries a different tone. And the suggestion from this conference is actually, if somebody acts like a Persian, eats like a Persian, does like a Persian, we should call it Persianism and not barbarian. I think it's time to sort of think of this term and this term rather than just using the classics with a terminology that has a different meaning today. We know already from the time of Ardashir, the founder of this dynasty, that he is the king of Iranians. And that's what he is claiming, at least on his coins, from the first imperial coins that he mints. Interestingly, a bit later in the 3rd century, we have these special gold minted coins, which Nioli has, of course, written multiple articles about, which takes the title, Bahram II, Ir Mazdis, so a Mazda worshipping Iranian. To my mind does every ear need to be an Iranian? And what does that mean? If you're Mazda worshipping, then you become an Iranian? Or could it be a non-Mazda worshipping to be called Iranian as well? Do you have to be Zoroastrian to be Iranian? Or could you be a non-Zoroastrian to be Iranian? That's a matter that is what has been in my mind. And I think in the 3rd century, you have to be a Zoroastrian. This Mazdaism is tightly connected with the idea of Iran. What happens in the 5th century, I think, transforms this empire. Not only the influx of different religious groups, but also nomadic and sedentary groups is going to reshape the idea of what Ir or Iran is. And this is not Arabs coming by themselves. Shapur II in the 4th century actually resettles Arabs from Arabia and around the Persian Gulf in Kerman and so on. Arabs didn't show up in the 7th century on the Iranian plateau. They had already been moved. In terms of Armenians and Jews, there are suggestions that actually it's not Shah Abbas who brings Armenians from the Caucasus first. It's Shapur who brings actually Armenian artisans, some of them seem to have been Jewish, at least according to sources, that's a matter of debate, to the Iranian plateau. The Huns, as a general term, I'm talking about the Kidaras, the Alkhons, and so on, of course, who are pressing on the east, are going to defeat the Sasanians early on. And that defeat, Richard Payne has suggested that creates a rethinking of Iran and what Iran is vis-a-vis these others. And I think Turan as an idea of an identity begins to get adopted by the Easterners within this milieu of Iranian view. Whether it's on the west, there's Rome, on the east, there's Turan, which I'll talk about in the last lecture, and in the middle is Iran. So there's some sort of negotiating identity going on. Now, I have just been reading on Chinese history, and I think this book by Chittick, Andrew Chittick, The Yan Qing Empire in Chinese and World History, is quite instructive of late antique Chinese world. My Chinese colleagues run away when they hear the name of Antique Tardif, Spät Antike, or Late Antiquity. They say in China, that doesn't mean anything to us. But in fact, I think Chittick, in some very interesting ways, has shown and suggested that in the 5th century in China, really interesting developments took place. This Sinitic universalism, this aspiration to universalism, through administrative, vernacular, and religious work, very much matches of what we think, I think, not only Gupta India, which we know least of these perhaps, but also the Sasanian Empire and that of the Romans. So this is the empire that Chittick is sort of, or the kingdom is dealing with, that I have used as a model for what is going on. And so I really like to compare things within their cultural norms or this Asiatic norm that I was talking about. It's healthy to both compare it with the West or the Mediterranean world, but also to look at the Asiatic model, which I think is much more in tune with the Sasanians than these other places. What happened in the late 5th, early 6th century, under the rule of Khosrow I, and his father probably began, is the Great Reform, militarily, administratively, fiscally, as well as intellectually. I showed you the quadripartition of the empire. These really began this 4 quarters, the generals and so on are part of this reform, but also a legal reform. If we have a cursory look at the only surviving, or one of the surviving, the only one, Sasanian law books, the Madigan Hezardadistan, what we can excavate, is that terminologies are now being used for men and women of the empire, which I have put in the parentheses, citizen, really jumping on the sort of the Roman idea of civitas. But it appears that the king's law, now this legalistic society, is coming into being. That is, the idea is Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and Buddhists, regardless of religious thing. If you recognize the king's law, it's Dod, they can exist and coexist. Now, of course, there are differences. When there are local problems, that is, for example, among the Jews, you go to the local rabbis, there's a prison under the synagogue, you're put there, that's a different thing. But all in all, there is a king law at work. And if you recognize this, you become part of this empire, which has an aspiration, I think, after with Khosrow I, into this universalism, which exists in Rome, but I think in China and in Iran. And I call this a cultural turn, not the law, but other things. The administrative control you can see quite clearly. I'm just using one mint maps, but also of course, seal evidence done through the past 3 decades or more by Rika Gizlen, we find that administratively there is control over the empire. You look at the mint practices, when Khosrow mints year 10, almost invariably in all provinces you see the similar, almost exact minting practice. So this seems to be unified. This tells us that there's a unified empire here. It's centrally controlled compared to some other people who think that the empire wasn't centralized. That is quite clear in that way. But then the idea of being Eri, so being Iranian or having Iranian traits, begins to make shape and give us information through Middle Persian texts. Now, in Middle Persian texts, there's this thing called frahang. In Persian, frahang means culture, and I'm just pushed to this Arabic term adab. I keep being pushed in adab. That means the way you react, the way you act, the way how you eat, how you do things, and so on, is quite important. I think in the 6th century, we're beginning to see a change from ethnos, a Zoroastrian who is an Iranian, to anyone who adopts these cultural traits. And I'm going to go through these cultural traits with you, this adab. So let me give an example. How do you become an Ir? Actually, we were talking to Mr. Abedi, who has just written a book on ta'aruf, this courteous sort of Iranian gesture that drives, I think, many people, especially Europeans, really crazy, this courtesy. And I'm wondering how far this is, but if you're Iranian or know about ta'aruf, that is what I'm talking about in terms of traits, iri, at least today. But foodways, when we talk about food and identity, we get very interesting results. Laya Ziai Bigdeli, who I was on her committee, did really an important dissertation on materiality, foodways, and the construction of elite cultural identity in late antique Iran, where dishes, all the accoutrements of sort of eating are in a specific cultural setting, how you eat and so on. And of course, food had been on my mind for a long time. What you eat and who you eat with are all signs of this habit, your eri, as I would say. But I think this eri goes also not only physical, emotional, and cultural characteristics. And so food and identity gives us a sense that these Iranians eat this way, but those others eat that way. The Iranians like to eat this type of food, as this Ayadagar Jamespi, as Agostini has translated. You know, the Indians eat rice, and it has some anthropological sort of thing. They're not so active, let's say. The Arabs eat this food, but they make them much more strong and sort of, are able to conquer. So it's an anthropological also study of what you eat and who you become. And of course, there are some rhythons, and we know that the Greeks drank in one way, the Persians did it in another way, the way you held a fiale, even with the 3 fingers or so, even the rhythons, how it was drunk, it was quite different. You knew that's a Persian way of drinking, so eri, as opposed to the Greek one. So the manner that you do is like, but it's beyond that, as I said. I mentioned this in the first lecture quite briefly. You can see this is a belt and this is a hat, kolah and kamar, or kolaf and kamar, hat and belt. It's quite interesting that Jewish sources, again, the Talmud tells us, and Jakob Nussner in the 1970s had already picked up on this, that some Jewish rabbis were criticizing other Jews that were wearing the Persian hat and the belt. It's of dignity or a sign of sort of nobility, or you want to be in that way. And the Jewish rabbis said, why are you acting Persian? So I would say if you partake in that, you're trying to be part of this eri world. Here is a silver dish that shows a couple or a king or a noble and a lady sitting on what we call a takhti or gahwarak. In Middle Persian, I think we have gahwarak, I'm not sure. And you can see there are pillows, and the number of pillows signify rank. I think 7 is the utmost. And in fact, couches and pillows meant a lot. Who sat with you on the pillow, on the couch, meant a lot. But also the number of pillows. We are told in the Armenian text, Patvos Buzan, an important text, that the Armenian king came before the Persian king, and they sat together on the same couch. They wore the same clothes and the same number of pillows. When the Armenian king became unruly in another time, when he was invited, his couch was sent by him all the way to the end of the hall, was given a few pillows, and he was so mad that he even threw those pillows on the floor and left. Of course, he was arrested. So these are what I call eri, Iranian traits, and the Armenians understood it. My colleague has dealt with this, McDonough, Professor McDonough, that the Romans really never understood how to deal with the Armenians, while the Sasanians did. The Romans usually like to pay off people, as they call it, subsidies. You pay people, and they're going to. And the Armenians didn't always go along, and the Romans were mystified. Why are these people not taking the gold? And sort of, but when the Persians talked to them and gave them honorifics and gave them dinners and sort of put them on the pedestal, it worked much better because there was a cultural understanding. I call this eri. There is some sort of here a sign of eri that the Romans are not getting in that way. Okay? So it's the pillows and the hats and so on, but also celebrations. Nowruz, the Persian New Year, and the Mehregan, the equinox celebrations. My colleague Simcha Gross, in his book on just recent book published, Babylonian Jews and Sasanian Imperialism in Late Antiquity, discusses how some rabbis were forbidding this because of these celebrations, because the Jews were celebrating it. They were both celebrating the Nowruz and the Mehregan. And in fact, we know in the Abbasid period they were doing it. So they continued to do it. And I think in this way you become an heir. You eat like an heir, you dress like an heir, and you walk like an heir. Okay? And the same goes for the Christians, who seems to have been celebrating these Iranian holidays as well. What else do? You play like an heir. What are the games and things to do? You play chess and backgammon. If you know chess and backgammon, that seems to be part of this eerie world. If you're nobility, of course, the chase. Polo, Cholvigan, which, of course, Samra's father, Dr. Azarnush, the late Azarnush, has written much on the game of polo, and I'm hoping to have an English translation of it as well. It's quite important as part of this cultural tradition. These are the things that make you an heir. Some of this, of course, is connected to the aristocracy. It is going to trickle down to others as well. And you think, and you're educated like an heir. So you go to a place to learn a culture. There's a short Middle Persian text that is really great that I think Juncker has done a really good translation. It's in Pazand, if I'm not mistaken, Sambra. It's called Hishkari Ridagan, the duty of children. It's at two sections. One is for like children, and I read through it and I remember my childhood as if it's basically a continuous of this idea of doing iri. You wake up, you have to do this, you go to school, you listen to your teacher, you don't hit a rock at a dog, you have to be listening to your parents. You know, it's a typical education. And the second part is someone who's a little bit older and has to get education and has to know the subjects, and if they don't know, they should be embarrassed and look at the ground, if I'm not mistaken, because they have not done their work. And they should know about the past and so on. And of course, Samra Azanish has also most recent translation, let's put it, of the text of Khosrow Ridak. Really a sort of interesting text on all the good things that could exist. A young boy goes to a king, and the king wants to test him, and so asks, what's the best meats, where the good wines are made, desserts, fruits, and so on, what to do. In the meanwhile, in the beginning, he has gone to school. He tells us he knows how to write. I think there's barik, so sort of, and writing sort of fast hand, or using, calligraphy. He knows it all. And it's all those things that if you're part of this Iri world, you have to know. And I think all of these signs creates what this being an Iranian is. It's a cultural term. It's not attached to an ethnicity anymore. Mr. Farnout, who's sitting there, who just gave me his book last week, I went through it. If you look in this transition period, the number of foods that are being discussed in the Abbasid court, namely from two important books that he has, I think, taken about 150 recipes, Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq and al-Baghdadi, we find so many of these Persian terminologies within the early Islamic, which I think in a way continues this iri in its manners, in how to do. And the Abbasids do ask, how did the Persian king eat? Was there a curtain when somebody showed? These are all the signs that I think continues in that way. And this is not only, I think, to bring this, and I'm not doing this because Frantz and Anka are here, but rather to think, well, we get all these, sometimes called Central Asian, Kushan, kind of strange and maybe not very Iranian subjects on both. I think someone who's has aspiration to these universalism probably knows some of these other tales and traditions and are able to actually accommodate it. For example, this bowl that may be relating something that is not Iranian, but it can be made into Iranian taste, and it could be absorbed as such. And I think it's in this way that when Islam comes, because if you're a Jew or you're a Christian and so on, the idea of Iran or the Iranian manners and what to do as in Iran survives beyond its Islamization. And that is, I think, a huge point in contradistinction to these other civilizations that are conquered and absorbed by the Muslims. And I'm not saying that the Iranians are very different, but as the fifth Tabatawi used to say, we're both within Islam and outside it. We're kind of dangling in between. This is an inscription from a Christian who went to Constantinople. I think there's consensus that is actually post-Sasanian, although there's a debate on this, if it's a fifth or post-Sasanian. However, if it's either Sasanian or post-Sasanian, it's a Christian who on his tomb says that this person actually is from Iran Shahr. He is from Iran Shahr, and that's interesting. Oops. So he has this cognizance of whoever was with him as a Christian, knows that he comes from Iran Shahr. And he had come to Byzantium or Rome to study. And so this is the cultural term that is of the subject today. Thank you.